Your name is William Wallace, and you're about to die the most agonizing death ever devised by human cruelty. It's August 23rd, 1305, and you're lying on the cold stone floor of the Tower of London, listening to the roar of 20,000 bloodthirsty Englishmen gathering outside to watch you suffer. The iron shackles around your wrists have cut deep wounds that never stop bleeding. Your body aches from weeks of torture, but that pain is nothing compared to what's coming in the next 4 hours. Through the narrow window, you can hear vendors hawking meat, pies, and ale to spectators who've traveled from across England for this entertainment. Children laugh as their parents describe the creative ways your body will be destroyed piece by piece while you're still conscious. The executioner just visited your cell to explain exactly what he'll do to you, how long each stage will last, and why you'll remain awake through most of it. You close your eyes and try to remember Scotland, the green hills where you once rode free, your wife's face before English soldiers murdered her, the victory at Stirling Bridge when you proved Scottish steel could cut down English knights. But those memories feel like dreams now, fading against the very real knowledge that in 3 hours your intestines will be burning in a fire while you watch helplessly. What you're about to experience isn't just execution. It's systematic torture, designed to break your spirit, destroy your legacy, and send a message to anyone who dares challenge English power. King Edward Longshanks didn't just want you dead. He wanted you unmade, transformed from Scottish hero into English propaganda. You think you know about William Wallace's execution from movies and history books. Here's what they don't tell you. The real story is so much worse than Hollywood could ever show, so brutal that English chroniclers themselves struggled to find words for what they witnessed. What happened at Smithfield on that August morning represents the absolute peak of medieval cruelty, a performance of human suffering that took 4 hours to complete and was designed to destroy a man's humanity before ending his life. The worst part? Wallace remained conscious through almost all of it. Before we follow Wallace through his final nightmare, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you think you can handle the truth about what medieval justice really looked like, subscribe and smash that like button. The path to Wallace's horrific death began not with battlefield defeat, but with betrayal by his own countrymen. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had bent the knee to Edward Longshanks, trading their independence for English gold and the promise of keeping their lands. Wallace's continued resistance made these collaborators look like cowards, and cowards with power are the most dangerous enemies of all. Sir John Menteith was one such man, a Scottish knight who'd chosen survival over honor. He'd been hunting Wallace for months on Edward's orders. The bounty on the Scottish rebel's head was enormous, enough silver to buy an entire castle. But Menteith's motivation went deeper than greed. Wallace's very existence was a daily reminder of what Menteith had given up when he submitted to English rule. The trap was set near Glasgow in August 1305. Wallace, exhausted from years of guerrilla warfare and running out of safe havens, trusted the wrong man. Contemporary accounts suggest Menteith invited Wallace to a supposed meeting with other Scottish resistance leaders. Instead, English soldiers were waiting in the shadows, armed with chains specifically forged to hold the most wanted man in Britain. When they dragged Wallace from that ambush, bleeding from sword cuts and barely conscious, the English soldiers knew they'd captured more than a rebel. They'd taken the living symbol of Scottish defiance, the man whose name could still inspire farmers to take up arms against trained knights. Edward had been hunting this prize for 8 years, and now William Wallace belonged to him completely. But here's what makes the betrayal even more sickening. The English didn't just want Wallace dead. They wanted him alive long enough to break him publicly, to transform Scotland's greatest hero into England's greatest cautionary tale. The journey from Scotland to London was designed as the first stage of his destruction, a mobile torture session that would prepare him for the main event. Wallace was bound in specially designed restraints that prevented him from sitting or lying comfortably during the 3-week journey south. The chains around his wrists were deliberately too tight, cutting off circulation and causing his hands to swell grotesquely. English guards took turns describing in graphic detail exactly what awaited him in London, painting verbal pictures of the torture that would soon become reality. In every English town they passed through, Wallace was displayed like a captured beast. Local crowds gathered to throw refuse and spit on the men who dared to kill English soldiers. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to get better views of the Scottish animal who'd forgotten his place in Edward's natural order. This wasn't just transport, but psychological warfare designed to strip away Wallace's dignity before the real torture began. The cruelest part was how English chroniclers recorded these displays. They wrote about Wallace's degradation with the same casual tone they'd used to describe livestock being moved to market. To them, he'd already stopped being human the moment he challenged English authority. The man who'd once commanded armies was now just raw material for Edward's political theater. By the time Wallace reached London, weeks of systematic humiliation had taken their toll. Contemporary accounts describe a man whose body showed clear signs of prolonged abuse, whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd already glimpsed his own destruction. But his spirit remained unbroken, a fact that would make his upcoming torture all the more satisfying for English audiences. The English had perfected the art of breaking rebellious subjects, but Wallace represented their greatest challenge yet. Here was a man who'd already lost everything that normally kept people compliant. His wife was dead, his lands were gone, his followers had abandoned him. Traditional leverage wouldn't work on someone who'd already sacrificed everything for his cause. So Edward decided to try something different. Instead of quick execution, he'd create a spectacle so horrific that it would echo through Scottish memory for generations. Wallace's death would become England's masterpiece of terror, a work of art painted in blood and agony that would hang like a sword over every future Scottish rebel. The trial at Westminster Hall was pure theater, conducted in Latin that Wallace couldn't understand, with charges read by judges who'd already decided his fate. But the real performance was still to come. At Smithfield, 20,000 English citizens would gather to watch their king's executioner transform a Scottish hero into a screaming example of what happened to those who dared challenge English power. Wallace spent his final night in the Tower of London, listening to the sounds of construction as workers built the platform where he'd die tomorrow. Carpenters hammered together the wooden frame that would display his suffering to maximum effect. Blacksmiths sharpened the knives that would open his body while he still breathed. Even the fire that would consume his organs was being carefully prepared. Seasoned wood arranged to burn hot and bright, so the crowd could see every detail of his destruction. At dawn, on August 23rd, English guards dragged Wallace from his cell and stripped him naked in front of jeering crowds. His body, marked by weeks of abuse, was bound to a wooden hurdle designed specifically for this form of torture. The hurdle wasn't meant to kill, but to inflict maximum pain during the journey from the Tower to Smithfield, turning every cobblestone into an instrument of agony. The horses that would drag Wallace weren't ordinary workhorses, but specially trained animals that had learned to maintain a specific pace. Too fast, and their victim might die too quickly, robbing the crowd of its entertainment. Too slow, and the spectacle will lose its impact. These horses had dragged dozens of traders through London streets, and their handlers knew exactly how to maximize suffering while keeping their cargo alive. As the procession began, Wallace's naked body scraped against rough cobblestones that had been deliberately left unsmoothed for this purpose. The hurdle's design ensured that his spine and skull would absorb maximum impact with every bump and turn. Contemporary witnesses described the sound of his body bouncing against stone as sickeningly rhythmic, like a drumbeat marking time until his death. The route through London had been carefully planned to pass through the city's busiest districts during peak hours. Vendors abandoned their stalls to follow the procession, selling food and drink to spectators who treated this torture like a festival. Children ran alongside the hurdle, some throwing stones while others simply stared in fascination at their first glimpse of state-sanctioned violence. English guards encouraged crowd participation, providing stones and refuse for those who wanted to join the fun. They explained that Wallace had killed English soldiers, burned English villages, and dared to claim that Scotland could govern itself. Each crime justified more violence, more degradation, more systematic destruction of the men who'd once commanded armies. By the time the procession reached Smithfield, Wallace's body was a mass of cuts and bruises, his skin torn in dozens of places by the relentless scraping against stone. Blood marked the route like a crimson trail leading to his destruction. But he remained conscious, his eyes still focused, his breathing still strong enough for what the English had planned next. The crowd at Smithfield had swelled to over 20,000 people, making it one of the largest gatherings in London's history. They'd been waiting since before dawn for the best viewing positions, some bringing children who'd never seen a proper execution before. Vendors worked the crowd, selling meat pies and ale while explaining to newcomers what each stage of hanging, drawing, and quartering would involve. The scaffold itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, built low enough that every spectator could see Wallace's face during his torment, but high enough to display his body to the entire crowd. The wooden platform had been sanded smooth so that blood would flow freely rather than pooling, ensuring that viewers could watch every detail of his destruction without obstruction. The executioner who waited on that platform was Master Robert, England's most skilled practitioner of judicial murder. He'd refined the art of hanging, drawing, and quartering through years of practice on English traders, learning exactly how long a man could hang before unconsciousness set in. His job wasn't to kill quickly, but to bring Wallace to the very edge of death, then pull him back for more suffering. The noose around Wallace's neck was positioned with mathematical precision. Too high and it would snap his neck instantly, ending the show before it began. Too low and he might die of strangulation before the real torture started. Master Robert had measured the rope to ensure that Wallace would experience exactly the right amount of oxygen deprivation, enough to cause agony without causing death. As Wallace was hauled up by the neck, the crowd erupted in cheers. They could see his face turning purple, his body convulsing as it fought for air that would never come. His legs kicked frantically in the empty air, a dance of death that the English audience found hilarious. Children laughed and pointed, while their parents explained what was happening to the Scottish animal who dared challenge their king. Contemporary accounts describe the sounds Wallace made during this hanging as unlike anything witnesses had heard before. Not quite human screams, not quite animal cries, but something in between that suggested a soul being torn from its body. The crowd fell silent during these moments, mesmerized by the raw sound of suffering that echoed across Smithfield like a prayer to dark gods. Master Robert watched Wallace's eyes carefully, looking for the telltale signs that consciousness was fading. The moment those eyes began to roll back, the moment the body's struggles began to weaken, he would cut the rope and bring his victim back to the world of pain. This timing was everything. Too late, and Wallace would die. Too early, and he might retain enough strength to resist what came next. When the rope was finally cut, Wallace crashed to the platform like a sack of grain, his body convulsing as oxygen flooded back into his starved brain. But there was no relief in this resurrection, only the knowledge that his suffering had barely begun. The crowd cheered as they watched him fight for breath, his chest heaving as his body tried to recover from near death. English chroniclers noted that Wallace's eyes remained clear throughout this ordeal, suggesting a will that refused to break even as his body approached its limits. This defiance only made the crowd angrier. They'd come to see a Scottish rebel broken and humiliated, not to witness dignity in the face of torture. Their bloodlust demanded complete destruction of everything that made William Wallace a symbol of resistance. The executioner allowed Wallace several minutes to recover, not from mercy, but from professional necessity. What came next required the victim to be fully conscious, fully aware of what was being done to his body. The crowd grew restless during this brief respite, shouting suggestions for creative ways to increase the Scottish rebel's agony. Master Robert approached Wallace with a knife that had been sharpened specifically for this moment. The blade was designed not for quick killing, but for precise cutting that would open the human body without immediately causing death. English law required that traitors be disemboweled while still alive, conscious enough to watch their own intestines burn before their eyes. The first cut opened Wallace's abdomen from just below his ribcage to his pelvis, slicing through skin and muscle with surgical precision. Contemporary witnesses described the sound of this cutting as unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that fell over Smithfield. 20,000 people held their breath as they watched the executioner's blade separate flesh from flesh, revealing the pink and red interior of the human body. Wallace's screams during this disemboweling were so intense that several spectators fainted, while others covered their children's ears despite having brought them specifically to witness this education in English justice. The sound seemed to come from the depths of human suffering itself, a noise that suggested the very moment when a soul begins to separate from its body. The executioner reached into the open wound and began removing Wallace's organs one by one, holding each piece up for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared for this purpose. The smell of burning human flesh mixed with the excited cheers of the audience, creating an atmosphere that witnesses later struggled to describe in their written accounts. Wallace remained conscious throughout this entire procedure, his eyes tracking the executioner's movements as his own body was systematically destroyed before his gaze. Medical knowledge from that era understood that a human could survive disemboweling for several minutes if the major blood vessels were avoided, and Master Robert had the skill to ensure maximum suffering duration. The symbolism of burning Wallace's organs wasn't lost on the educated spectators in attendance. Medieval theology taught that the bowels were the seat of compassion and mercy, while the heart contained courage and defiance. By burning these organs while Wallace watched, the English were symbolically destroying everything that had made him a threat to their authority. The crowd's reaction to this peak horror was mixed fascination and revulsion. Many had never seen the inside of a human body before, and the clinical precision with which the executioner worked made the entire process feel almost medical rather than vengeful. But the victim's continued consciousness reminded everyone that this was torture, not surgery. English guards standing near the platform reported that Wallace attempted to speak during this disemboweling, though his words were lost in the noise of the crowd and the crackling of the fire consuming his organs. Some witnesses claimed he was praying, others that he was cursing his tormentors. The truth died with him, but his determination to communicate, even while being literally destroyed alive, became part of his legend. By the time the executioner finished removing Wallace's organs, the Scottish rebel's body had been reduced to something barely recognizable as human. Yet somehow, impossibly, he still breathed. His heart still beat. His eyes still tracked movement around the platform. The crowd fell silent again, awed, despite themselves, by this display of human endurance in the face of ultimate suffering. The beheading that finally ended Wallace's suffering came almost as an anticlimax after the hours of systematic torture that preceded it. Master Robert's axe severed the neck with a single stroke, bringing merciful death to a body that had endured more punishment than most people could imagine. But even in death, Wallace's ordeal wasn't finished. The executioner held the severed head up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the neck as 20,000 English voices cheered the final destruction of Scottish defiance. But this wasn't the end of the spectacle. Wallace's body was quartered into 4 pieces, each section displayed to different parts of the crowd, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. Edward Longshanks had ordered that these body parts be sent to different Scottish cities as warnings to anyone who might consider following Wallace's example. His head was preserved in tar and mounted on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a reminder of what happened to those who challenged English authority. The 4 quarters of his body traveled to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed in public squares. The immediate political impact was exactly what Edward had hoped for. Many Scottish rebels laid down their arms rather than risk facing similar torture. The brutal efficiency of Wallace's destruction had demonstrated English power more effectively than any military victory could have achieved. Fear became England's most effective weapon in controlling Scottish territories. But Edward had miscalculated the long-term consequences of his cruelty. The extreme brutality of Wallace's execution transformed him from failed rebel into martyred saint. Robert the Bruce, who witnessed the execution personally, later claimed that seeing Wallace's torture convinced him that accommodation with England was impossible, and that only total independence could protect Scottish dignity. The story of Wallace's suffering spread across medieval Europe, damaging England's reputation among other kingdoms. Foreign chroniclers describe the execution as evidence of English barbarism that exceeded even the worst excesses of previous ages. What Edward intended as a demonstration of strength became proof of weakness, showing that English rule required such extreme violence that it could never be truly stable. Within a generation, Wallace's name had become a rallying cry for Scottish independence fighters who preferred death in battle to capture by English forces. The very torture designed to prevent future rebellions had created a powerful symbol that would inspire resistance for centuries to come. William Wallace died at Smithfield believing he had failed. His armies were scattered, his country occupied, and his body was being systematically destroyed as entertainment for English crowds. He couldn't have known that his suffering would echo through history as one of the most powerful examples of dignity maintained under ultimate pressure. The detailed documentation of Wallace's execution, preserved in English chronicles that meant to celebrate Edward's victory, instead became evidence of medieval justice at its most cruel. These accounts, written by witnesses who attended the torture as entertainment, reveal the systematic nature of state-sponsored violence that characterized medieval political control. Modern analysis of hanging, drawing, and quartering shows that this method of execution was specifically designed to maximize psychological impact rather than simply end life. The staged progression from humiliation to near death to revival to systematic destruction created a narrative of suffering that would haunt observers long after the physical spectacle ended. The medical reality of what Wallace endured challenges modern understanding of human pain tolerance. Contemporary accounts suggest he remained conscious through procedures that would incapacitate most people within minutes. Whether this was due to unusual physical resilience, psychological conditioning, or simply determination to deny his torturers the satisfaction of seeing him break, remains unknown. The political consequences of Wallace's execution extended far beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms observed Edward's methods with interest and horror, understanding that similar brutality could be applied to any noble who challenged royal authority. The execution became a case study in state terror that influenced political thought for generations. Perhaps most significantly, the extreme nature of Wallace's torture backfired completely in its intended purpose. Instead of discouraging resistance, it inspired more determined opposition than diplomatic pressure or military defeat ever could have achieved. Edward's masterpiece of cruelty became the foundation stone of Scottish national identity. The preservation of Wallace's story in both English and Scottish sources creates an unusual historical record where victim and perpetrator perspectives survived side by side. English chroniclers documented the technical details of his torture, while Scottish sources recorded its impact on national consciousness, providing modern historians with a complete picture of how systematic violence shapes both individual suffering and collective memory. Wallace's legacy reminds us that human dignity can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it, and that sometimes the greatest victories are moral rather than military. His 4 hours of agony at Smithfield purchased something that no army could conquer: the knowledge that some principles are worth any sacrifice, and that the human spirit can triumph even in the moment of the body's destruction. The stones of Smithfield have long since been replaced, but the echo of that August morning in 1305 still resonates through every struggle between tyranny and freedom, reminding us that the choice between comfortable submission and dangerous dignity is one that every generation must make for itself. If these forgotten voices of history matter to you, subscribe for more investigations into the darkness that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which buried truth you want me to uncover next, because there are so many more disturbing stories waiting to be told.